Good evening, everyone. I'm Ayman Mohyeldin in New York. We are continuing to follow that dramatic breaking news out of Israel, where the Palestinian militant group Hamas has launched an unprecedented attack on southern Israel. At around 6:30 a.m. local time this morning, Hamas forces fired a barrage of more than 2,200 rockets from Gaza into Israel. That is according to the Israeli military. While Hamas fighters took to the air, the group also infiltrated the country's southern border by both land and sea. The Israeli military says an unknown number of civilians and soldiers have been taken hostage by the group. It is an assault the likes of which the country has not seen in decades. Following Saturday morning's attack, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu vowed, quote, mighty vengeance, and said the country was now in a state of war. Israel has already responded by launching airstrikes of their own, including one that flattened a multi-story residential building in the heart of Gaza City. The strikes continued well into the night, with flashes lighting up the sky as explosions can be heard and seen across the city. Israeli officials say at least 200 of their citizens have now been killed, more than 900 injured. In Gaza, at least 230 people are dead and another 1,600 are injured. That is according to Gaza's Ministry of Health. Just a few hours ago, President Biden delivered his first public remarks on the escalating situation overseas, doubling down on the U.S.'s support for Israel.
You know, when I spoke with Prime Minister Netanyahu this morning, I told him the United States stands with the people of Israel in the face of these terrorist assaults. Israel has the right to defend itself and its people, full stop. There's never justification for terrorist attacks. And my administration's support for Israel's security is rock solid and unwavering. Let me say this as clearly as I can. This is not a moment for any party hostile to Israel to exploit these attacks to seek advantage. The world is watching.
We have all angles of this story covered. Starting us off this hour, Dan DeLuce, NBC News national security and global affairs reporter, and Ali Rafa, NBC News White House correspondent. Ali, I'll start with you with the comments that we heard just there from President Biden. Obviously, the administration has been very heavily involved in what has been taking place across Israel. We've been hearing from the Secretary of State as well as the Secretary of Defense. What more can you tell us on the U.S. response at the moment in coming to support Israel?
Yeah, I mean, well, we're continuing to see really this all-hands-on-deck posture from the Biden administration that began in the wee hours of the morning when this was still developing, and that is continuing still right now. We have this coordination and communication among national security officials, senior Biden administration officials, the president, the vice president, cabinet officials, the secretaries of state, homeland security, defense, just to name a few, all trying to get an assessment of the latest situation on the ground there as far as intelligence and just getting familiar with what exactly is happening there to be able to formulate what their response is going to be. You heard the president say in that speech there that he is committed to making sure that Israel is going to be able to defend itself for as long as it needs. He said that was a major focus of his call with Prime Minister Netanyahu this morning. And of course, we know that decades-long history and relationship that these two leaders have had. Sometimes it's been rocky, but the president assured the American and Israeli public that those differences that they've had would not get in the way of U.S. support for Israel. The big question now, Ayman, is what that support is going to look like. We know that Israel is the #1 recipient. It receives the most U.S. aid right now. There's big questions as to whether that aid could, the number that in specific aid could potentially shift. We know that according to U.S. officials, as of late this morning, Israel had not requested to adjust that number, but obviously that could change. We don't know whether that support could come in the form of more military aid or more intelligence help. We have learned that U.S. officials have enhanced their intelligence sharing with Israeli officials because at the heart of this situation was undoubtedly an intelligence failure. We know that U.S. as well as Israeli officials were caught off guard and surprised by this. We know Israel is renowned for its impressive and sophisticated intelligence and defense systems, and yet those still were not able to deter this massive amount of incoming fire that came from these Hamas militants. So the big questions now, as I said, remain: what are the next steps as far as this pledged continued aid and support from the Biden administration to Israel as this situation just continues to grow worse, Ayman?
Ali, and I'll follow up with Dan about this, but in the White House statement that was put out earlier, there was a stern warning to any of Israel's adversaries or possible enemies not to exploit the situation. Do you have any reason or any reporting from the White House to believe that there was activity or cause of concern for the United States right now, and to put that statement, to put that sentence in the statement that preceded the president's remarks?
Yeah, White House officials are not saying exactly whether there was any concrete evidence that would prompt the president including that in his speech. But we know just more broadly from a foreign policy perspective and platform, we know that any sort of escalation in this region comes with it the risk of other Middle Eastern countries having tensions flared. And we know that Israel is the closest ally that we have in the Middle East. It is the country that shares our democratic values. So obviously the United States is concerned that any sort of increased tension, increased aggression in this area could trigger other countries to follow suit. And obviously there's enough to deal with just the situation in Israel. So trying to tamp down any potential surges in the neighboring areas, Ayman.
All right, Ali, stay with me for a second. Dan, what are you hearing from your sources and your reporting, both about the intelligence failure that led to this moment? Obviously, I am sure U.S. intelligence are combing through whatever data they may had over the past 24 hours, 48 hours, to see if there was anything that could have signaled an imminent attack that they could have shared with Israelis. But do we have any insight right now as to how and why a operation of this magnitude was missed?
Yeah, I don't think we have the answer here, Ayman. I think it does represent, by all accounts, a tactical failure. Really, Hamas achieved a tactical surprise in this situation, and it is, I think, all the more surprising given how Israel has this reputation of having such an excellent, highly effective intelligence service that for years had been able to penetrate Hamas and other adversaries. So I don't think we know the answer to that. It's also going to raise questions about its defenses on the border, how it was positioned there, and how Hamas fighters could have managed to do this. So on the one hand, I think for years they were bracing for a Hamas attack, but on the other hand, they were not apparently ready today. And I think the U.S. was also taken by surprise, and it does harken back to 50 years ago to the Yom Kippur War, when Israel was caught flat-footed, and that, of course, led to a lot of soul-searching at the time.
Dan, there's no doubt that there's going to be a lot of questions in terms of how Hamas pulled this operation off, whether or not its backers in Iran were tactically involved, meaning were they able to, beyond just provide them with the weapons, but involved in the actual planning of the attack. Do we have any indication, is there any intelligence assessment to indicate whether or not Hamas was getting a tactical support from Iran or Iranian proxies in the region?
I was talking to former intelligence officials, and they were saying they believe that's almost certainly the case, that there must have been the Iranians' help and assistance with such a sophisticated, complex attack. And it had a lot of kind of echoes of how the Iranians have been operating over the years, those kind of guerrilla tactics. And I think it was telling what the president said, that warning sort of for others not to exploit the situation that was clearly directed at Iran and Iran's proxies in Lebanon, Hezbollah. And of course, Israel has to worry that they may get it from that side as well.
Ali, we know that the White House has been working the phones with allies in the region, including the Arab allies that have peace treaties with Israel, including Egypt and Jordan as well. Have we gotten any readouts as to what diplomatic efforts are taking place right now from the White House in terms of trying to either secure or work on securing the release of the Israeli captives that have been taken into Gaza?
Yeah, I mean, that's another big question we have as far as these calls that we're hearing that the president has been making throughout the day. What came out of these calls? We know that Biden administration officials have given us a little bit of a summary on what not specifically, but overall what was discussed on those calls. But we're still awaiting readouts of the specifics, whether there were any specific asks made or demands, specifically, as you mentioned, with Egypt and the neighboring countries. We do know that the president also spoke with the King of Jordan in addition to Prime Minister Netanyahu. So that is something that we're out to the White House looking for, and we do await those readouts of those calls.
All right, Ali, Rafa, Dan DeLu starting us off this hour with all those updates. Thank you to the both of you. Coming up, we're going to take a closer look at that intelligence failure, both here in America and in Israel. Don't go anywhere. Hamas's attack took Israeli intelligence officials by surprise, particularly the various methods the militants used to enter and leave Israel. Let's turn now to those intelligence failures. I'm joined now by Colin Clark, Senior Research Fellow at the Sofan Center, and Norman Rule, non-resident Senior Advisor with the Transnational Threats Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Gentlemen, it's good to have both of you with us. Let me start, if I can, with you, Colin, and the element of surprise here. Israel's deterrence has always been that it had superiority with the element of surprise, with the element of initiative. In 1967, we saw that. We see that in other conflicts that it has. But what we saw today was something very different, the initiative being seized by Hamas militants and exposing something that we perhaps did not know that Israel was vulnerable to, this kind of coordinated, multi-pronged attack with land, air, and sea components. What do you make of how significant of a failure this is, both on a security level, but also psychologically to Israel?
Thanks for having me. I think it's a massive intelligence failure. It's going to have political reverberations. It's going to have domestic reverberations within Israel. And it's really just astonishing. I mean, to me, I still am struggling to wrap my head around it. Not only was Hamas able to have, fairly sublime operational security or OPSEC, and the fact that, if you look at how sophisticated and complex this attack was, something that was clearly in the works for weeks, if not months. And so keeping that under wraps, keeping that away from any kind of Israeli human sources, Israeli signals intelligence or SIGINT. And I think, I have to imagine that all of the domestic political turmoil in Israel played some kind of a role here. We'll find out in the coming days and weeks as there's a forensic into exactly what went wrong.
So to that point, Norman, that Colin just brought up, which is when you think of the Israeli government's capabilities and what they've been able to demonstrate in the past, Israel has no doubt infiltrated some of the highest ranks of Palestinian militant organizations. They've carried out successful assassinations of Palestinian militants, high-ranking military officials within the paramilitary wing of Hamas. How is it that they were not able to detect this? I mean, how could Hamas have pulled something like this off without the human intelligence component, without the signal intelligence component, without perhaps even the surveillance component of what is being brought in and brought out of Gaza? And do you think that Egypt shares some of that blame as well for the border that it has with Gaza not being as tightly controlled as it possibly should have?
Good evening, and thank you for having me. This certainly does represent an intelligence failure, but there are a number of countries, to include the United States, that one might ask why we didn't have a better insight into Hamas preparations for this attack, their planning, their development of tools, their intelligence selection, and, by the way, their plans going forward. We're talking an awful lot about the terrible events of today, but we are in the early days of what is likely a lengthy crisis, and our understanding of where that crisis will lead is on the desk of every major policymaker. What happened today was in the past. There will be a follow-up investigation to this. The Israelis had such an investigation after 1993, but right now the intelligence emphasis on all of the countries in the region and ourselves is going to be what happens tomorrow.
So speaking of what happens tomorrow, trying to get a readout of where these captives that Hamas has taken back into the Gaza Strip might be right now. Talk to me about what that kind of operation looks like from an Israeli perspective, from a U.S. intelligence gathering perspective, trying to find out where these captives are, where they're locating them, if they're moving them from one location to the other, and ultimately how that may be used by Hamas and the militants in Gaza to leverage what Israel calculates as its next steps.
It's a tremendously complicated task that will involve an array of different intelligence analysts, understanding the sorts of vehicles used, the personalities engaged in this action, their supporters, their logistics, what reflections we might see in the support architecture of Hamas that would indicate that something unusual is happening at a location. It's really quite complex and involves a multi-int human intelligence, signals intelligence, geospatial intelligence approach to this. I'm sure that the United States is offering the Israelis not only whatever intelligence support we might have, but any sort of technical assistance we can provide to expedite the safe return of these hostages and to prevent any further loss of life in Israel or Gaza.
Colin, your thoughts on that? And we certainly heard some, and according to NBC reporting, that the U.S. was considering sharing with Israel other intelligence gathering capabilities. What might that look like? What resources does the U.S. potentially have that the Israelis don't have, or that the Israelis would need more of in this particular moment as they consider the next 24 to 48 hours?
Well, with all due respect to Norman, and I do have great respect for him, I find it hard to believe that the United States should be expected to have more exquisite intelligence in Israel's backyard than the Israelis themselves. We're not talking about a suboptimal partner here. We're talking about the Mossad and Shin Bet and kind of world-class intelligence. So, of course, the United States as an ally will help. I'm just shocked that the Israelis weren't prepared for this. How could Washington be more prepared than the Israelis for what's going on with Hamas? We're not talking about Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, even a country, like Iran. We're talking about Hamas. This has been Israel's main adversary for decades. So I just find it, puzzling that, people are looking to the United States to have better intelligence than the Israelis, at least on this particular group. What does the U.S. do next? I think we pull out all the stops. We probably share everything we have, and we're going to lean in on, the technologies that we bring to bear. Signals intelligence, human intelligence networks, as Norman mentioned, multi-int operation here. But this is not going to be easy by any stretch. We're talking about urban warfare. There's tunnels built under Gaza. Clearly, Hamas will have been preparing for the response here. So I think we're in for a very, very uncomfortable 24 to 48 hours, especially when we think about the hostages.
And there is two parts to whatever Israel does right now in response. One is the securing of these captives that are inside the Gaza Strip, Norman. And two, it is the broader question as to what does Israel do to kind of return either a deterrence or return calm on the border, or to some extent eradicate Hamas. There are some Israeli officials who are already calling for that right now, to try and destroy and uproot Hamas from the Gaza Strip. Is that even a possible scenario right now militarily? Is that something that once Israel makes that decision, it could potentially do? Because as I've mentioned before, I've covered multiple wars in which Israel has gone into Gaza, both not just airstrikes, but including land invasions, only for them to come out after a couple of days or a couple of weeks declaring a victory, saying Hamas's capacities have been decimated. But we still find ourselves year after year with this growing threat.
Thank you. It's a great question. I would like to respond very briefly to my good friend Colin's comment regarding the United States. It is the absolute responsibility of the United States to protect Americans abroad. There are hundreds of thousands of Americans in Israel. We don't cede responsibility for any threat to any other partner. That doesn't mean there isn't a partner that might have best eyes on the target, or we would work with them. The issue as to what intelligence material we would share with the Israelis is going to be difficult. We have an extremely close relationship with the Israelis, and we already share a vast amount of information with them. It's going to be difficult to imagine that we have a cigar box somewhere that says material we didn't share with Israel because we didn't think it was ready. Now, we may have some technical capacities, some satellite work or other work that we could offer to augment Israeli capabilities on specific operational missions, and we could bring analytical firepower to the table to allow them to better sort through the vast amount of information. Regarding what happens next, we're in the early days of what is likely a long event. This is a tectonic issue. This isn't just a 9/11 event in terms of the crisis it brings, but 9/11 had ripples in the United States that we feel to this very day. The domestic impact on Israeli politics, the regional politics, I think it's going to be difficult to determine in the near term, but U.S. policymakers, as I say, are going to be focused heavily on what is happening in the region and in Israel and what we can do to minimize the loss of life, to include loss of life of Palestinians in coming days.
I know, very important points on all fronts. Actually, I want to talk to both of you specifically about that just after a break. I want to squeeze in a quick break, Colin and Norman, and then come back and continue the conversation. Please don't go anywhere.
I'm Jason. I'm living.
Discount code LOVE.
Let's continue the conversation now with Colin Clark and Norman Rule. Over 200 Israelis killed. The Gaza Health Ministry says 232 Palestinians killed in Gaza in those Israeli airstrikes that came after. Colin, you know, the comparison that has been made from the surprise element of this and the intelligence failure is obviously 9/11, but I want to talk about how we responded to 9/11 and the lessons learned from that and whether or not this could be the way that Israel responds. In our case, we were going after Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda. In the case of Israel, they're going after a militant organization that is deeply embedded into the fabric of Palestinian society, certainly in the Gaza Strip. How does that complicate how Israel responds with going after the militant wing, and whether or not they're going to make that distinction now as they, I assume, continue and escalate operations in the territory?
It's a great question, and I've been seeing the 9/11 comparison all day, and I have to admit, initially I thought it wasn't the best analogy, and as I've tracked this throughout the day, I think it actually is quite a good fit. Now, for me, the lesson I draw is, how does Israel respond to this without doing what the United States did in the aftermath of 9/11, and that's overcommitting, right? We kind of walked into the trap that bin Laden set and did exactly what he wanted us to, which was launch multiple invasions in Muslim countries, get bogged down in fighting counterinsurgencies around the globe. The goal was to bleed us dry, right, to bankrupt us and kill our soldiers. So what can the Israelis do differently now than they've done in the multiple operations they've launched against Palestinian militants over the years, whether that's Operation Cast Lead 2008, 2009, Operation Pillar of Defense 2012, Protective Edge in 2014, Guardian of the Walls 2021, right? The Israelis have been, as they call it, mowing the grass for a long time. How do they kind of right-size this and calibrate it in a way where they can go after Hamas, attempt to weaken the group, but not get sucked into a longer-term, drawn-out conflict that likely involves Iran? That's going to be the key question here.
Yeah, and for our viewers who are seeing that image on the left side of the screen, that is a live picture of Gaza City and the Gaza Strip. You can probably hear there in the faint background what appear to be explosions, an indication that operations are ongoing, both from the Israeli side as well as Hamas rockets being launched from the Strip into Israel proper. We know that the Israeli ministry had announced, the Israeli minister who is responsible for the delivery of electricity into the Gaza Strip, which Israel does provide to some portions of the territory, territory announced earlier today that electricity would be cut off. Israel provides the bulk of electricity to Gazans in the territory. Egypt does provide the others to the southern part of the territory. Norman, there was a mention earlier in the conversation by Colin, which I thought was an important point about the impact this might have on the political dynamics inside Israel. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had always positioned himself, if you will, as the best choice for Israelis when it came to safety and security. In fact, he ran a campaign ad against his opponents, basically saying that these types of attacks could never happen under a government that he leads because he is the most committed Israeli prime minister to its security. How significant of a setback is this for him and for his specific administration?
Prime Minister Netanyahu is going to have to show himself to be pretty tough on this issue. Israel has a new generation that has seen something the previous generation last saw in 1973. Hundreds of Israelis are dead, more than 1,000 wounded, 22 active fire sites in Israel today, 54 hostages spread into Gaza. The political weight of public opinion will make it very difficult for him to do anything but react very harshly against Gaza, and that's going to be difficult because there are no specific military targets, just a massive number of civilian areas with terrorist enclaves. Within Israel itself, there has been also some unusual movement where Yair Lapid, an opposition leader, is offered to form a national unity government temporarily to fight this issue. Is that a ladder to get Netanyahu away from his hardline allies? Probably not, but I think we should understand that this is a shifting situation. And again, we're in the very early hours, and I doubt even Prime Minister Netanyahu knows how this will end.
If we were looking at this as concentric circles, Norman, and obviously being the most inner circle is being what is happening right now in Gaza, if you are a U.S. intelligence official trying to assess where this conflagration can ultimately lead to, how far does this go? I mean, we know that Egypt and Israel have a peace treaty. Jordan and Israel have a peace treaty. The UAE, certainly Morocco, the countries that matter the most to the vicinity immediately of Israel, with the exception of Syria and Lebanon and Iran.
Well, all of that is correct, and I think we also need to point out that the drivers for regional integration have not gone away. Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, they want a relationship that involves the geography of Israel to establish a connection with Europe. The Palestinian issue will go to the forefront in negotiations on the U.S.-Saudi-Israel issue, and coming up with some sort of a deal that provides better economic gains for the Palestinians will be likely the direction we'll head up. The problem is that we're facing is that Israel has 53 hostages, and getting those hostages back is going to be a long-term, complicated effort, and the public will support the harshest measures against Hamas to return these innocent civilians and military officials.
Colin, final question to you about the calculation that Netanyahu had made, which was he felt as he came into office to change the equation from trying to solve the Palestinian issue first and then going out to get broader peace with the Arab world, to trying to go out and get broader peace with the Arab world, to come back and get peace or force peace upon the Palestinians. Has that changed as a result of today?
Well, we'll have to see, but it definitely puts the Saudis in a really difficult spot. Right, if things were going smoothly and moving along, and we actually had a Sufan Center intel brief on Friday about this very issue, the Palestinians have been backburnered, and this is a checkmate to that, right? They won't be ignored. They're putting this as an issue back on the table for the quote-unquote Arab street throughout the region. And I think, those folks that are calling the shots in Riyadh are going to have to think long and hard about where they stand here. And I think Norman's right. They do want a deal with Israel. They do want to move forward. But what about the Palestinians? They can't simply be left on the sideline, or we're going to continue to see incidents like this going forward, I think.
Yeah, a reminder that you ignore the Palestinian issue at your own peril when you're dealing with the broader Middle East. Gentlemen, thank you both. I greatly appreciate your insights and analysis. Colin Clark, Norman Rule, thank you for your time on what has been a long and difficult day. Coming up, I'll speak to Democratic Congressman Rajna Krishnamurthy, a member of the House Intelligence Committee, about all that has transpired today. Stay with us.
Detect this. Living with HIV, I learned that I can stay undetectable.
NBC News reports that the U.S. is discussing enhancing its intelligence sharing with the Israelis to support the Israeli government during the ongoing conflict with Hamas, according to a U.S. official and source familiar with the discussions. Joining me now is Democratic Congressman Rajna Krishnamurthy of Illinois. He is a member of the House Intelligence Committee. Congressman, thank you so much for making time for us. So can you tell us, have you been briefed on what has happened inside both Israel and the Gaza Strip as of this evening? Do you have any updates that you can share with us on what we've learned in terms of the scale and scope of this operation?
No, we're actually going to get a full-scale briefing in the classified setting and in the secure facilities in Washington when we go back. Right now, we are basically receiving more of the unclassified information that is accessible to everybody at this point.
We've been hearing the comments and the reporting to suggest that there may be capabilities that the United States has that it can share with its Israeli counterparts. Can you shed any light on what that might be and how soon that might be shared with the Israelis?
I think that it's being shared right now. I think that this is something that is a top priority for U.S. officials. Look, Ayman, I think your viewers and you know extremely well the urgency of locating and getting those hostages back from Gaza Strip. I think that's priority number one. There's tremendous pressure on the Prime Minister to respond right now, but at the same time, he and his government have to be thinking very carefully about how any operation impact the welfare of those hostages. And so I think priority one is that. I think a big second priority is trying to prevent any further attacks, especially from other terrorist groups, Iran-backed groups like Hezbollah in the north, and of course trying to figure out whether Iran had a hand in any of this.
How do you go about assessing that? I mean, what do you think the administration should be doing right now in assessing whether or not Iran had any specific role in this, but more importantly, the points that you raise, which is the decision-making process within Israel to not jeopardize the safety of those taken inside Gaza or the Palestinians that are inside Gaza, or at the same time, further operations from militant groups against Israel?
Well, I mean, these are incredibly complicated questions. I think that in past scenarios, our analysts do an excellent job of going back to try to figure out what was missed in the collection that might have given clues as to what we saw today, and then trying to look forward to see if what they've learned could be applied to the collection happening right now to see if we can plug any holes and maybe foreshadow or foresee what's coming. But this is all a very time-intensive endeavor. On top of all that, I'm sure that our excellent partners and allies and friends across the region and around the world are being enlisted to help in this effort because at this point, I think everybody is thinking very hard about what happened today and preventing it from happening again. I think most countries, our friends, partners, and allies were shocked by what happened and stand solidly with Israel as it tries to respond.
You say to prevent something like this from happening again. I mean, is there a chance that we can return to the status quo? And if not, what fundamentally has to change? What do you think, as a member of the U.S. Congress, which gives billions of dollars in aid to Israel and supports the Palestinian Authority, and part of the American government, which is heavily invested in this conflict, what do you think fundamentally needs to change so something like this does not happen again?
Well, look, as you know, the immediate task at hand is to deal with what is transpiring real time on the ground. But in the medium and long term, we have to recognize that what the terrorists, in part, were trying to do was to destroy any chance of a lasting peace agreement that is being fashioned among the different parties. They are deathly afraid of, the United States brokering agreement with the Saudis and Israel and the Palestinians, especially in the West Bank. And we can't let them thwart those efforts. So I think that although today we have to be 100% laser focused on dealing with the hostages, dealing with the terrorists, cleansing Israel of these terrorists and preventing further attacks, in the medium and long term, we have to return to the project of bringing true stability in that area.
So just to make sure I understand it clear, do you believe that part of the reason Hamas carried out today's attack was to thwart a possible Saudi-Israeli peace deal?
I believe so. I haven't seen evidence of communications to that extent, and I'll be looking for that when I go back to Washington, D.C. But I think the main point is that Hamas has been on the outs, as you know, for a long time, ever since Israel left the Gaza Strip a very long time ago. They've been further isolated. They've become very much a proxy of the Iranians. And as you also know, many players in the region want to try to come together in a peace agreement, in part to deal with the threats posed by the Iranians. And so it would not be a surprise or a stretch to think that Hamas would fear any kind of lasting peace deal that the Americans are brokering in the region between these other parties.
So when you look at it from an intelligence perspective, and Israeli officials have talked about the operations they have carried out going as far back as 2008 in Operation Cast Lead, then again 2012, 2014, and more recently 2021. Those operations at the time, Israel described them as being successful for having weakened and destroyed Hamas. But as we can clearly see from today, that is not the case. So I guess what has to be done to change that dynamic? What changes in order to prevent something like this from happening again? If Hamas is just getting stronger year after year, despite Israel going in and, as they say, mowing the lawn?
Well, obviously weeds have grown in that lawn, and I think that at this point we have to, probably go back and figure out what did we miss as we were trying to gather intelligence about Hamas. What was it that they were able to marshal in terms of resources, as well as from whom did they get these resources, and then try to plug those holes as best as we can. But until we get the answers to those first questions, it's hard to determine exactly what the next steps are to prevent this from happening again with regard to Hamas.
All right, Congressman Raja Krishnamurthy of Illinois, thank you so much. I greatly appreciate your time. Up next, we're going to examine the conditions that led up to this unprecedented strike on Israel. Stay with us. In a statement, National Security Council spokesperson Adrian Watson said the U.S. unequivocally condemns the unprovoked attacks and stands firmly with the government and people of Israel. Secretary of State Antony Blinken shared a similar statement, noting that the U.S. condemns the appalling attacks by Hamas terrorists against Israel, including civilians and civilian communities. Let's bring into the conversation Martin Fletcher, former NBC News correspondent and bureau chief in Tel Aviv, somebody who knows the region extremely well. Martin, it's great to see you, and I'm sorry that it is on this sad day, but here we are again talking about what has happened. And my first question to you is, what are the conditions that led to this moment in time?
That's a big question. I mean, we have like 75 years of Israel's existence, one has to say, and they've been struggling with the Palestinians the whole time. Look, Hamas has been always very clear that it doesn't want to be party to any peace process with Israel. They want to destroy Israel. That's in the Hamas charter. We know that very well. And they've been building up, attacking Israel. How many times you went through the dates recently? I think like 5 times. There have been 5 mini conflicts, mini wars between Israel and Hamas over the last 15 years. This, of course, blows everything else out of the water. I mean, this is so huge. It's a complete change in tactics. It's frankly, a brilliant military operation by Hamas, coordinating air, land, sea, artillery, rocket fire against Israel. So it's been building for a long time. Something happened. We don't know yet why Hamas decided this is the time for launch such a really the make or break operation against Israel, but they certainly took Israel by surprise, and they shouldn't have taken Israel by surprise because this has been building for a very long time.
When you look at, and you certainly have the historical perspective of comparing it to 1973 and the surprise attack that happened then, but that was a conventional war with the most powerful, at the time, the most powerful Arab country, the Egyptian military, and the Syrians attacking both the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights, which were at the time under Israeli control. The element of surprise has to be psychologically defeating for Israel. Just to be able to live through today and see what has happened is something that is going to reverberate for years to come in the same way that 1973 shocked Israel for decades.
No, absolutely. I mean, this is a complete destruction of Israel's so-called conception of how to deal with the Palestinians and how to deal with Hamas in Gaza. This completely shatters it. They've got to start from scratch. The comparison with 1973 is really interesting. Actually, I was in Israel as a news cameraman when they were attacked by Syria and Egypt on the 6th of October 1973. Yes, it was a surprise, but actually it wasn't a complete surprise because Israel at that time had intelligence information. They just interpreted it wrongly. This time it appears there was no intelligence information at all. The intelligence chiefs were taken by surprise. That's what we know now. That may change in the next few days or when there's a real examination of what actually happened. But that question of surprise completely shatters Israel's the concept that Israel is invulnerable. And the call by Hamas for Arabs in the West Bank, Arabs inside Israel, Arabs in Syria, Arabs in Hezbollah in Lebanon, the call for them all to rise against Israel. On the one hand, it hasn't really happened yet, but it does emphasize Israel's vulnerability.
And speaking of going forward, I just want to get your thoughts. I mean, you and I have been on the ground in Gaza many times, and we've covered these, as you said, these kind of, by comparison to this, I just want to be clear, by comparison to this, small-scale wars, not a full-blown war. But what options does Israel really have right now? I mean, militarily speaking, because on one hand, they have eliminated and assassinated the most senior members of Hamas's political wing, spiritual leaders, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. They've assassinated senior military commanders of the Qassam brigades and Islamic Jihad officials. They have done that. And they have also, as we saw in 2014 and in 2008, gone into Gaza and invaded Gaza. So what can they do now that would produce a different outcome from what we have seen over the past 15 years?
Well, you put your finger on it, produce a different outcome. Look, Israel's got two choices right now, really, which is to say, okay, we need to deal with Hamas one way or the other, negotiate, or we've got to break them. And Israel, at each time, always says, we're going to break them, we're going to destroy their military capability, we're going to bring security to our people. It hasn't worked. Every couple of years there's been another outbreak of fighting. This time, from what I'm being told, they will go in with all their strength. They will destroy any area where Hamas has training facilities, weapons facilities, headquarters, administration. They say they're going to destroy the place. And I think one has to take them at their word for the time being. Israel's warned the population of Gaza City to leave town. That's a lot of people. And they say they're going to continue with their airstrikes and destroy any Hamas installation. The question is, will they go in on the ground? And that's always the question. And they may go in briefly. The problem, of course, now is the hostages. What do you do with at least 50? We don't know how many are there. The Israelis have a substantial number, but probably it's over 50 hostages taken. What do? Do you risk their lives? And I know Israel has what they call a doctrine, what they call the Dahiriyah doctrine, which it comes out of when they destroyed the southern suburbs of Beirut. When they were fighting the Palestinians there, right. They'll go in and they'll destroy the place. That's what they say they're going to do. And frankly, I think I take them at their word. Right. The question is, what happens to the hostages? They may become victims. We don't know.
We're going to have to wait and see. Martin, thank you as always. It's good to see you. Appreciate your insights as always. Stick around. We're going to have more breaking news coverage at the top of the hour.